Hi, everybody. Welcome once again to another virtual town hall. I'm so glad that you're here, whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, or our website. I hope this is an informative 90 or so minutes where you're going to learn the latest about what we're doing in Washington, the coronavirus, and a lot more. This is the first one of our town halls since the middle of March, where I am coming to you live from Washington, D.C., from our office here. It is a little surreal in that I'm here in our DC office and the Capitol is largely empty, but nonetheless, I'm grateful to be with you, and I'm very grateful to our guests as well who are joining us from the district. Before we dive in, I'd like to introduce them. We've got two amazing guests. One is Reverend Madison Shockley, pastor of the Pilgrim United Church of Christ in Carlsbad. In addition to his pastoral duties with Pilgrim, Reverend Shockley serves on the board of directors of the American Civil Liberties Union of San Diego and Imperial Counties and the board of directors of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And we're so grateful that you're here again, Reverend. Also, for those tuning in for the first time, Dr. Carl Steinberg, our good friend, is a nursing facility and hospice medical director in North County, earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard. In fact, I've got two Harvard guys here. Please don't gang up on me too much. I do have my Stanford mug here in my office today. Earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard, went to the Ohio State University College of Medicine, and completed his family medicine residency at UC San Diego. Again, welcome, Reverend Shockley, and welcome, Dr. Steinberg. Thank you both.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, this has been a very difficult time for our country, a time of great sacrifice and loss, and I stand with millions of Americans across the country who are still mourning and demanding accountability, demanding comprehensive reform in many ways. And of course, one of those is our police system, a system that has allowed police brutality and injustice against people of color for generations. For far too long, we have failed to act. And I have said time and again, that to have real healing will require real reform. And I'm proud of the work that's been done by my colleagues here in the House, and proud to tell you that tomorrow a bill that I co-sponsored, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2020, will be voted on. It will pass, I am confident, will pass the House, and it will be sent to the United States Senate. The Senate, unfortunately, was not able to move a meaningful bill. Earlier today, you may have seen that the Justice Act did not move out of the Senate. My hope is that our Justice and Policing Act will earn the consideration that it deserves across the Capitol in the Senate. I don't expect Mitch McConnell to agree with every word of the Justice and Policing Act, nor do I expect his Republicans in the Senate to agree with every word. But what I do expect is fair consideration of our bill. I hope that they mark it up, hold hearings, offer amendments, and let us come forward on a bipartisan basis and actually meet this moment in our history. I hope that the Senate acted in good faith in creating the Justice Act. I hope that their bill was more than just a messaging exercise, but my great hope, again, is that the two sides can come together around some real reforms. And I hope the bill is one of many steps that we can take towards a more just system that ensures that George Floyd and others are not forgotten. I also can tell you that I've had many good discussions, both with the local civil rights community and with the local law enforcement community about this bill and about the measures in the bill. And many of our local law enforcement agencies and officers are a lot more open to these reforms than people like to say. I think sometimes we see things in binary terms, but I think that negotiation is very possible, just as it was as California negotiated a use of force standard through AB 392 and Dr. Shirley Weber's outstanding work. I do think there is an openness and a desire to see a national use of force standard and much else. The Justice and Policing Act has a number of provisions. I'll go through them very briefly. Prohibits racial profiling, discriminatory profiling, mandates training for all law enforcement on profiling, bans chokeholds, bans carotid holds, bans no-knock warrants at the federal level, limits the transfer of military-grade equipment to state and local law enforcement, mandates dashboard cameras and body cameras, establishes a national police misconduct registry to prevent officers who are problematic from moving to one agency to another without any accountability, amends the federal criminal statute from a willfulness standard to a recklessness standard to successfully identify and prosecute police misconduct, reforms qualified immunity so that individuals are not barred from recovering damages when police violate their constitutional rights, establishes public safety innovation grants for community-based organizations to create local commissions and task forces to help communities to reimagine and develop concrete, just, and equitable public safety approaches, creates new law enforcement development and training programs, and many of the recommendations of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force are embraced by this bill. It also requires the reporting of use of force data disaggregated by race, sex, disability, religion, and age, improves the use of pattern and practice investigations, and creates a program for state attorneys general to develop authority to conduct independent investigations into problematic police departments. In speaking this past week with our outstanding Attorney General, Javier Becerra, that was of particular importance to him. And finally, it establishes a task force to coordinate the investigation, prosecution, and enforcement efforts of federal, state, and local governments in cases related to law enforcement misconduct. This bill, as I mentioned, is important. It will be voted and passed tomorrow. I'm very grateful to my friend Karen Bass, as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, for working so hard on the bill. There are some other things that I'd like to mention. We recently celebrated Juneteenth, and my friend Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas had a resolution that I co-sponsored that we're going to be passing as well, commemorating the 155th anniversary of the ending of slavery in the United States, and the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act, which would create a federal holiday to recognize and celebrate the ending of slavery in the United States by adding Juneteenth to the list of federal holidays. I also am co-sponsoring my friend Barbara Lee's Confederate Monument Removal Act, introduced very recently, that would remove all statues of people who voluntarily served the Confederate States of America from the National Statuary Hall collection here in the United States Capitol. Also, Speaker Pelosi removed the portraits from the Speaker's lobby that we see every single day here in the Capitol from the hallway of those four former Speakers of the House who were involved with the Confederate States of America. They're no longer in Statuary Hall. My great hope is that all these actions are indicative of a new normal, and that we're really just scratching the surface for what the House and hopefully the Senate and perhaps a new administration might be able to do to meet this moment. But for now, we're going to advance the Justice and Policing Act, and we're going to fight very, very hard in Washington for those necessary reforms. I wanted to turn in a minute to the COVID pandemic, but before I do, I want to turn it over to Reverend Shockley, who's been such a great leader in our community, led one of the recent Black Lives Matter rallies in Carlsbad. There have been so many peaceful protests all throughout our district. I attended two of them a couple of weeks ago. I was so impressed by the incredible range of ages and backgrounds and experiences and races out there. Really, it was I think, a transitional moment, a historic moment, one that we have to make sure is followed by historic reform. So with that, my friend, Reverend Shockley, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Congressmember Levin. It's really my pleasure to be here with your constituents, of which I am one. I live in Oceanside. Let's not forget that. I have to agree with you. My church is here in Carlsbad, and I am so proud of Susan Munn and Sierra Gonzalez, who are the two young ladies that organized the Carlsbad protests. I'm especially proud of them as they are alumni of Pilgrim United Church of Christ youth program. They're both college graduates and have come. Well, Sierra helped to organize it from Oregon, but came down for the event. It is no question that this is a different looking moment in our history. The Carlsbad protests probably gathered about 3,000 to 4,000 people here in Carlsbad over 3 days of peaceful march, rally, protest, and consciousness raising. I was honored to be one of the many speakers who addressed the issues of racism and police brutality in our nation, in our state, and even in our communities. It's important that we take advantage of this moment. The idea that in a town like Carlsbad, which is 1.5% Black, and our adjacent neighbor, Encinitas, is 0.5% Black, to see thousands of people, most of whom are not Black, marching for Black lives is a moving and powerful image. But as you stated, it's going to take the police and justice, the Justice and Policing Act is going to take action on state and local levels to really make this different looking moment into a lasting moment of transformation. And that's what we're going to need. And it's going to take work, hard work. Every time that America has talked about this conversation on race, they've postponed it. And whenever you postpone something and finally get around to it, that work that you postpone just stacks up on the work that accumulates. And so it's going to take everyone in this country to open their eyes to what's going on. We've all seen the videotapes of so many of these tragic deaths of unarmed Black people at the hands of the police. Opening your heart to be able to be willing to hear again the truth that we've been speaking for centuries about what happens in our lives. I know that the idea of systematic racism infecting our police departments is something hard for people to swallow, but it is the truth. I don't know how else to express it. How can it be that almost every Black male that I know has had a uncomfortable to a dangerous encounter with police in their lives? I can't find one that has not had that. And in fact, I was talking to a colleague of mine and a classmate, and he told me about his first encounter was at 6 years old, when a white neighbor called the police on he and a buddy of his walking to first grade, who were balancing themselves on the cobblestones that were at the edge of his property. And the police came. And it's these kinds of situations where the criminalization of Black men particularly starts when we first learn to walk. And that view, that image, that presumption that Black men are dangerous and criminal has in fact infected our culture and the culture from which we draw our police officers. And while it's not written anywhere, I submit to you all that the compact that exists in our country is that police departments are hired by communities to protect you from me. We assume that Black men are dangerous and criminal, and we send the police out there to check on them, to stop us without probable cause, to harass us, to make sure we belong in the neighborhood, to prevent us from getting out of place. That mindset has to end, and we have to be treated as equal citizens and receive equal justice before the law. And the measures that you're taking in the House, the measures that are being advocated at the state and local level are just the beginning of the hard work we have to do, because it's going to take a transformation, not just of our police departments, but of the communities that hire them and pay them. Thank you for having me today.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Shockley, for those powerful words and for your leadership, truly inspiring in our community, and always grateful to see you, really grateful to have you as a constituent. And I'm glad that you didn't forget that. I wanted to focus for just a few minutes on COVID, but please stick around, Reverend, because we'll have a number of questions from our viewers that will pertain to the issues you just discussed. COVID-19 is still very, very real. It is critically important that we remember we're in the midst of a highly contagious pandemic. Our country has passed over 122,000 deaths from COVID-19. And again, it's not just a statistic. These are loved ones, family members, fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. These 122,000 people, I think, are for me a reminder of the incredible impact that this has had on our nation and really the entire world. The U.S. has the most confirmed cases by far, now well over 2 million. California, now you probably are aware, has gone into second place behind New York in terms of the state with the most cases. And in San Diego and Orange counties, I have watched very closely every day as the numbers have continued to creep up. What I do think is worth mentioning is that Orange County's rate of doubling has now surpassed that of San Diego County. The numbers in Orange County have almost caught up in terms of the number of infections. And this despite the fact that Orange County is testing significantly fewer people. Over the last 14 days, Orange County has tested less than 4,000 people per day. That continues to be an area of great concern of mine. I want to see testing ramped up. It's very important that we recognize the public health experts that we all know. We want the same thing. We want to get the economy back on track. But as I've said countless times over the last 3 months and throughout these scores of town halls that we've had virtually, you cannot have a healthy economy unless you have healthy people. So we've got to ensure the health and safety of the American people, and that means we need testing. When I saw the recent report that $14 billion that we had sent from Congress for testing is sitting unused by the administration, that's simply unacceptable. We've got to do better than that. The administration back on May 24th provided a report about what their national testing strategy was, and it was simply insufficient. We've done a number of things in Washington to try to address both the public health crisis and the economic crisis posed by COVID-19. I've gone through them time and again. I'll spare our viewers from going through them point by point, but suffice it to say is we have more work to do. We still sit with a 13.3% unemployment rate. We know that tens of millions of Americans are still seeking unemployment insurance. We know that our veteran unemployment rate, and I've had the great opportunity here in Washington to chair a subcommittee that has jurisdiction over veterans employment. We've seen our veteran unemployment rate go from 3.1% pre-pandemic now to almost 5 times that in a very short period of time. So now is not the time to take our foot off the gas. Our mayors in our district, Republican mayors, Democratic mayors, they came together and they said, we need more help from the federal government. And they signed a letter requesting that assistance. The bill that we passed in the House back over a month ago, think of it, over a month ago, we passed the HEROES Act in the House, and it's been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk, collecting dust. He's offered no alternative vision, no alternative plan. States and cities are on the brink, including in California. Many of our cities have had dramatic losses in transit occupancy taxes, if they're dependent on tourism, as many of our cities are. Other tax revenues have gone down significantly. They need assistance. You tell those school districts who are going to need to spend millions of dollars on reopening plans, the extent they can reopen safely, that they can make do with less money. That's simply unacceptable. We need to help our schools. We need to help our teachers. We need to help our frontline workers. That includes our law enforcement officers. And remember that just a month ago, Democrats in the House passed a $200 billion fund for our frontline workers, including law enforcement, and Republicans voted it down. Keep that in mind when you hear some of the more egregious claims about who supports those on the front line and who does not. So what do we do next? Well, again, now's not the time to say mission accomplished or to spike the football or to take our foot off the gas. We need action, and it's critically important that Mitch McConnell takes action. A lot of the programs that were in the CARES Act are set to expire at the end of July. That means expanded unemployment insurance will expire. It means also that programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, the application deadline for that program is coming up at the end of June. We need additional relief. Congress gets a report from the Fed periodically, and I read through it. I don't know how many of my colleagues actually took the time to read through it, but Jerome Powell was very clear. We are going to need more federal assistance to get through the worst of this crisis. Just the same, Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary. Well, I don't agree with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin on everything. I do agree with his call for more federal assistance. So let's work together. Let's get it done on a bipartisan basis, just as we have at every stage of this pandemic. We've passed now 4 bipartisan pieces of legislation since this pandemic started, and we can pass a 5th as well. And while we're at it, one other thing that I've been advocating for very strongly is emergency assistance for the United States Postal Service. We've got to save the Postal Service. It is on the brink of insolvency. That was pre-pandemic, was on the brink of insolvency. They've lost an additional $13 billion in revenue. This goes back to a 2006 law that Congress passed. Congress capped both the revenues and increased the expenditures of the U.S. Postal Service, all in one bill in 2006. So no surprise at all that the Postal Service has run in the red over the last several years. There are those on the other side of the aisle that want to see it privatized, but they fail to recognize the fact that 48% of the world's mail is delivered by the U.S. Postal Service. 630,000 Americans work at the U.S. Postal Service, and that includes over 100,000 veterans that work at the USPS. So if you care about veterans, care about those 100,000 veterans who work at the Postal Service. And I was proud to lead a letter of 137 of my colleagues calling for that lifeline to USPS. Another thing that I'm very proud of is the work that our community continues to do, the leadership that we have in our community on a variety of environmental issues. My background is as an environmental attorney and a clean energy advocate, and a number of great local wins on the environment. Earlier this month, I announced an $11.5 million grant from the Department of Transportation for the Del Mar Bluffs. And if you know anything about our district, our region, we have a rail corridor from Los Angeles to San Diego, one of the most strategically important in the United States, one of the busiest in the United States. And we've got sections of that corridor in desperate need of help because of coastal erosion. This money will help. I also was able to inform the North County Transit District they were going to get $94 million in assistance from the federal government to help get through the worst of the pandemic. A few months ago, you might be aware, we helped secure $300 million for the pollution at the Tijuana River Valley through the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. I'm very grateful to the San Diego congressional delegation and to Mayor Kevin Faulconer, as well as Mayor Serge Cedina of Imperial Beach and others who really led the way from Chula Vista, Coronado, and really grateful. And for those that haven't seen, it was a terrific 60 minutes piece on the Tijuana River Valley pollution that I hope you'll see. And earlier this year, I announced funding from the Army Corps of Engineers, both for Encinitas and Solana Beach and their coastal storm damage reduction project, and additional money for the San Clemente Shoreline Project. Finally, and most recently, earlier today, we had a virtual press conference and we announced the report, and here it is, from my San Onofre task force. It's a great report. It's about, 80 pages, give or take, 80 pages. And then there's about another 200 pages of technical material if you're really interested in seeing the technical backup. But I formed the task force during my first month in office. It's co-chaired by the former head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission under President Obama and by a retired Navy admiral with the goal of driving solutions to get the waste off the coast as quickly and as safely as possible. And as I've said time and again, the waste at San Onofre is really indicative of a greater problem. It's a symptom of a greater problem, which is that we lack a comprehensive strategy to deal with spent nuclear fuel in the United States. So the task force made 30 policy recommendations, many of which have a federal nexus. I took those federal recommendations and put out a list of 8 priority areas that my office will be focusing on in the days, weeks, and months ahead. And I'm just grateful to our entire task force for their great work. You can go to our website at mikelevin.house.gov and you can download your own copy of the task force report, and I hope you do so. Finally, I wanted to mention some new assistance for our veterans. I helped to introduce a couple of bills that I think have a great shot at becoming law. I mentioned them last week, but first is the Homeless Veteran Coronavirus Response Act that would allow VA to use existing resources to help our veterans at risk of homelessness or who are experiencing homelessness, many of whom cannot currently be helped by the VA for a variety of reasons. And second is the Veterans Economic Recovery Act. I mentioned the significant increase in veteran unemployment. This bill would create a year-long rapid retraining program to provide unemployed veterans and reservists with educational benefits to pursue training in high-demand occupations. I think it's a win-win and something that we desperately need to do. I also want to encourage everyone to go to our website to read the Coronavirus Federal Resource Guide that I published a couple months ago. Again, mikelevin.house.gov, and that has a ton of information about all the federal programs that are offered. There were recently some changes to the Paycheck Protection Program in addition to the deadline to apply coming up shortly. There were some other changes that were made to provide more flexibility to businesses, expanding the time that you can use the loan for from 8 weeks to 24 weeks and still have full loan forgiveness, as well as the percentage of the loan that you need to use for payroll being reduced from 75% to 60%. That was informed by a lot of our local businesses, and particularly our local restaurants who requested that flexibility. With that, and there's a lot this week, my goodness, but I am very pleased to welcome our other outstanding guest, Dr. Steinberg. Thank you, as always, for joining us for some opening remarks on COVID-19, after which we'll be turning to your questions. Dr. Steinberg, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, and thanks for having me back. And I want to welcome Reverend Shockley and thank you for your service to the community and the great church that you have, Pilgrim United Church of Christ. It's a very inclusive and it's a great church. So just putting in the good word there. And thank you for being here to discuss these very serious topics. And before I say anything about COVID, I just want to also say that I have felt heartened by the things I've seen in the last few weeks, saddened but heartened at the way people are dealing with it. And I share the concern that we don't want this to be another gun control thing where, there's 50 kids get slaughtered and then people forget about it a week later. And so let's hope that we can make some lasting and enduring change here. So a little bit off my topic area, but I can't help myself sometimes. So I also want to say this is the end of CNA week. If you don't know what a CNA is, and I know the congressman does, the CNA is a certified nursing assistant. They are the lifeblood of nursing. I mean, these are the people that are making minimum wage, maybe, and are on the front lines, putting themselves at risk every day, getting kicked, having to clean diapers. And they are wonderful people. When they get up in the morning, and look in the mirror, they don't have to ask themselves, am I going to be doing something that is of service to others today? And I just want to acknowledge, probably they're too busy. A lot of them work 2 jobs. Maybe they're not on this town hall, but if you know a CNA, give them a hug or a virtual hug, depending on what your situation is. So about COVID, there's been some kind of alarming, and I'm not an alarmist, but let's say concerning things that have happened over the last few days, week or two. I'm sure many of you are aware that the case, the number of new cases is going up in a lot of places and going up more rapidly. Arizona, Florida, and a lot of places. And we're seeing an uptick here too. In San Diego County, for example, I think we were averaging maybe 100 or so new cases a day. The highest had been around 200 or so. And then 3 days ago and 2 days ago, we had 2 consecutive days over 300 new cases. Even more alarming, we had one of those days, 7% of the tests that were done were positive. And another day it was 5%. Yesterday got a little bit better. So, but those are concerning, right? I think it suggests to me that we're not doing the best job of continuing to maintain social distancing and do all the things that are recommended. So I just want to put in a plug for everybody continuing to do the right thing. Wear a face mask, observe social distancing, wash your hands, and just try to be patient as we ride this out. I think we still have a long way to go. And, we've seen restaurants have to close, right? Including at least one in Orange County because employees tested positive. And we're seeing that in other states. And, I want to support local businesses, of course, but, how hard is that on a business to open and they have to reclose and they have to reopen? So I don't have a good answer to it other than just as far as our own personal safety and that of the people that we love, and even the people we don't love. We don't want to get people sick either way. So I think other than that, I'll wait until we get some questions. But I would say that we're continuing to have some issues with cases from El Centro. One of my colleagues, Dr. Asha Devereaux, who is from San Diego, has been out there in El Centro. She's an intensivist, pulmonary critical care doc, and she's out there helping on the front lines. They've got an alternative care site for people that are coming out of the hospital. And apparently there's only one intensivist in the whole area. And these are really sick people on ventilators. Many of them are getting sent to other parts of the state now. But anyway, it's far from over. And I hope we can just stay the course and continue to do the right thing. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those thoughtful remarks, Dr. Steinberg, and for your continued leadership. One of the areas that concerns me is the testing of asymptomatic individuals. We've discussed this before, but we just need to ramp that up. And of course, we are following what's going on very closely down in Imperial County as it impacts both San Diego and Orange counties and really our entire community. I've got a ton of questions from our viewers. We'll get through as many of them as we can. And I'll ask both of you to weigh in as appropriate. Our first one is from Margaret. Margaret asks, how exactly do we provide excellent educational opportunities for poorer communities? And how can we provide mentors for those children to give them hope that they can see how others have overcome and walk in their footsteps and feel and be supported? Well, I'll try to answer first, Margaret. I think one of the things I'm trying to do is be an advocate for our public schools. My own kids go to our local public schools, and I think it's so critically important that people from all backgrounds, all parts of our communities have access, children have access to an outstanding education. For me, there's no better investment that we can make in our future, and that includes treating our public school teachers with the respect that they deserve as the professionals that they are. And so I'll continue to fight for our public schools. I'll continue to fight for our public school teachers. Now, I'm particularly concerned in the wake of the COVID crisis that a lot of schools are going to be incurring significant expenses to reopen. I was talking with one of our superintendents. I've now had discussions, I think, with all of our superintendents, many of them, many discussions, multiple discussions, but the costs of reopening, to the extent that the circumstances and the public health recommendations are that reopening is going to be permitted, run into the many millions of dollars when you consider alone the need to reduce ratios and class sizes and have the adequate testing and have temperature checks and things of that nature. So I was very encouraged that the state, the governor in Sacramento, our legislature actually decided not to make draconian cuts to our public schools as part of the recent budget. I do think that from my feedback from our local education leaders that we need to do far more. So it starts with education. I think that, I was very fortunate to attend a public elementary school with a lot of great mentors and teachers. That set me on a good course. And I'm hopeful that the same will be true for our local public schools. Reverend Shockley, anything that you would like to add about how we can mentor our youth? And again, the question was, how can we provide mentors for those children to give them hope that they can see how others have overcome and walk in their footsteps and be supported, particularly in poorer communities?
Yes, and the first part of the question was how can we provide them with a better education? And this is a question that we're going to have to really wrestle with in depth. You've heard a lot about systemic racism. Systemic racism is also impacting our educational system. One of the main ways that our educational system is impacted by systematic racism is our pattern of housing segregation. Yes, when you have separate housing communities, as I mentioned, the demographics here in Carlsbad and Encinitas, and that's not much different from other areas in this district. And you have poor children, Black children, Latino children ghettoized in a separate school district. That's the first problem. And so in order to really impact the quality of education, we have to change the housing segregation patterns in our society. That's certainly a longer term program. Secondly, we have to improve, and now I am a teacher at heart. I respect teachers. They are the most altruistic professionals that we have in our society, but yet systematic racism also impacts our teacher corps. We also have teachers' unions, and I'm a union person, but their job is to represent the interests of their members. One of the things that we have to address in some school districts, the teachers, as they gain seniority, gain the opportunity to choose their own assignment. And time after time, those teachers who are inclined, after they gain experience and skills and talents, and they rise in their profession and they achieve that tenure, opt out of the inner city schools and go to the suburban schools. And that leaves the inner city schools with a constant turnover of teacher staff. Only the newest, freshest, and least experienced teachers, that's where they start. That's where they get their training. And so you give to the poor and Black and Latino children the least qualified among the teachers. That's systemic. And we have to address those issues. We have to say, if we want to improve their education, then we send the best teachers there. And I'm not at all suggesting that there aren't some of our best teachers there by choice. Not every teacher makes that election to leave. There are some outstanding teachers in these communities. And I have some here in my congregation that teach in schools that are heavily minority population. But these are the things that we really have to address to get the best teachers to them. Would undermine the need for mentors to join them as well. Mentors are gravy on top of the main course. Again, it's difficult to mentor from the distances that our communities live. Until we start to have more integration in our housing patterns, the mentors that have the time and experience and want and the will to help simply aren't accessible to most of the kids who need them. And so, we have to establish programs. They're going to have to drive. But ultimately, if we're going to solve this problem in the long term, we're going to have to come back to that fundamental question of our society, is how we can live together in peace with justice. And that means we have to still address the question of desegregating our communities.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful answer, Reverend. Our next question is from Socorro in Carlsbad, who asks, I've heard our governor say no amount of legislation will change people's hearts. The question here is, how do we go about changing people's hearts? How do we get people to see the potential in our youth, not the color of our skin? Perhaps, Reverend Shockley, I'll begin with you this time, and I can add a few thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Laws compel people to behave in a particular way. And that's certainly a starting point. I want the law to protect me from those who would attack me because of the complexion of my skin. But ultimately, the questioner is right. We want to live in a community where we want to live together, where we value the diversity that God has given us. And so, for example, nonprofits of every form and shape, churches as well, need to take this agenda to heart. We need to, again, engage in that conversation about race to help us unpack the racist patterns that we've fallen into unwittingly, those patterns that we were raised with unquestioningly. For example, at Pilgrim United Church of Christ here in Carlsbad, we're going to start a virtual Zoom book club, reading White Fragility together. I encourage everyone who wants to address this problem of racism to read the book White Fragility by Ms. D'Angelo. It is an excellent book. A white woman wrote this book for white people because racism is a white problem. Now, it impacts us, but y'all created it and it inhabits your bodies and your communities. And so we can defend ourselves against it, but we can't solve the problem. And so it's going to be thoughtful, prayerful, and truly compassionate conversations where people can feel safe enough to acknowledge their own racism. We cannot begin to purge the racism in our culture until we acknowledge its presence.
How do we sign up for this book club, Reverend?
PilgrimUCC.org.
All right, I appreciate it. I think you said it better than I possibly could. I think all I have tried to do in the last 3 to 4 weeks is listen and learn as much as possible, knowing full well my experiences have been fundamentally different because of the color of my skin. And that my hope is that through this dialogue that we can enact real reform. Since the murder of George Floyd, I've seen, as we said before, really a moment unlike any in my lifetime to actually do some good. And I feel very fortunate, very blessed to be in a position where I can go on the floor of the House of Representatives tomorrow on behalf of our district, our community, and vote to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020. And I hope it's, again, the first step of many that we can take on a bipartisan, bicameral basis, because that's ultimately what we need to get laws passed. But very grateful for your comments.
Just say the one other word about it. The Justice and Policing Act is important because the key to all of this is accountability. Police officers simply have been shielded from real accountability for their actions. And that's from qualified immunity, that's from state bills of rights for police officers, and particularly police unions. And the police unions have so much power on the local level because the politicians, and I've delved in politics as well, so it's nothing pejorative by saying that, but politicians recognize their economic power and their political power because when they say the community wants us to protect them, so you politicians have to protect us by giving them every concession that they ask for in their contracts, by giving them the protections that the police officers' Bill of Rights gives them, by maintaining qualified immunity. But it comes down to the people in the community. When they say, listen, this is not the kind of policing that we want, nor will support, then those contracts can be rewritten like they're doing in Minneapolis. Then those bills of rights can be re-examined so that accountability can happen. And then qualified immunity can be ended so that we can really, really begin to hold those officers accountable who misbehave and who are therefore not going to contaminate. You've heard the story about the bad apple, but the bad apple spoils the barrel. And so that's why we have to address this for my sake and for everyone's sake.
Well, I certainly appreciate your thoughts. I guess the only thing I would add, which is I think important, is that not all police associations are the same. I do think that a number of them are a lot more open to reform, and that's really been part of the discussion that I've tried to have whenever possible, is to be a bridge builder, to try to bring those folks who are interested in reform to the table, both in law enforcement and, of course, from the civil rights community. I was encouraged, particularly encouraged, by the recent written testimony, for the record, during the Judiciary Committee's hearing, where George Floyd's brother testified a couple of weeks ago. And the Peace Officers Research Association of California, which is the largest police association in the United States, representing 77,000 police officers in California, put a powerful statement forward, acknowledging the need for this to be a moment of reform, real reform. And a lot of the suggestions that they had, like a national use of force standard and other things, were unthinkable from an organization like that, even just a couple of years ago. So I do think that there is a window to have a productive discussion, not with everyone in law enforcement, but certainly with a lot of the more open-minded folks. And I'm very glad that a lot of those folks are local. I'm also encouraged that Carlsbad and Oceanside have embraced the 8 can't wait, the goals of Campaign Zero, and announced their desire to meet those standards. And I hope other local departments will follow suit. And we've got a lot of work to do, but I do think that the dialogue has changed, the tone has changed, even from just a few months ago. So I hope that it's a sign that we can get some real reforms. Next question. We've got a COVID question. Hopefully Dr. Steinberg is ready. Here's Julia's question, and it's a great one. If the numbers of cases of COVID in Orange County are rising, why are nail salons being opened up? And maybe perhaps, Doctor, you want to just speak more generally about this very difficult balance. I can tell you, I feel it as a policymaker. On the one hand, we all want to get the economy rolling. We want to get people back to work. We have to get people back to work. On the other hand, the acknowledgement that you've got to have healthy people to have a healthy economy. And you can't get out over your skis, or you're going to wind up infecting more people unnecessarily, killing people who otherwise would not get the virus. But care to comment on this delicate balance?
Sure. And I wish there were a simple answer to the question. There obviously isn't. And, maybe, you're just as qualified to answer this question as I am.
We're in trouble.
Well, as to when is it time to open things, I share the concern. I think this is probably, there are significant risks involved when you've got case numbers going up the way they are, to actually, creating situations where there's going to be more exposure. You're going to be indoors in an enclosed space. And I went and had a haircut. I wasn't looking too good a few weeks ago. And, the salon was like walking into a hazmat place, with the gowns and the visors and everything. And, I thought long and hard about it because I'm a nursing home doctor. And of course I wear PPE when I see my patients, but I don't want to take it into there. And so for each individual, it's kind of it's an individual decision. What level of risk are you comfortable with? But a nail salon, especially, where they use those little drills and the acrylics and stuff goes in the air. I would definitely have some concerns about going into a place like that, even if you're a young, healthy person who is not likely to develop severe illness from COVID. But it's the same thing with these restaurants. So many restaurants have gone under now, and it's really sad. I'm sure many of us are lamenting the loss of businesses that we frequented over the years, and then you think about the misery that is associated with that, with the business owners and all of their employees. But it's also a public health crisis, and so we've got to try to strike a balance. And I'm glad I'm not one of the ones that has to actually decide. But what I can do is I can decide to wear a mask. I can decide to keep myself away from people, and go about my business until this thing settles down a little bit.
Well, and I just to add to that, I do think that it's important to note that the situation in Orange County is getting worse, and to a degree it is in San Diego County as well. Orange County reported its highest one-day total of new COVID cases on this past Sunday. and they beat the record that they set on Saturday. So the other stat that I look at every day, I get reports from both San Diego and Orange counties, and I thank my team for participating on those discussions every day on those calls. But the 7-day average number of daily hospitalizations went from 202 in early May to 319 on Friday. And we also see the ICU numbers going up. And then, of course, we had the resignation of Dr. Nicole Quick, which actually made national news. And she is now the third consecutive person leading the COVID efforts in Orange County to resign. So I'm very concerned. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. We have a national crisis, and we need consistent leadership. And we can't be politicizing everything. We've got to follow the science. We've got to follow the direction and the guidance of our public health community. That means wearing a mask. It means socially distancing. And it means trying to do what we can out of basic common sense and decency for one another, to keep one another safe and to keep those safe in our families and in our communities who are at highest risk. And it means, as I've said repeatedly, testing, including more testing for the asymptomatic at higher risk of contracting the disease. Randy in Oceanside asks, will the federal government be helping out small commercial landlords that have not been able to collect rent during COVID? Well, Randy, in May, nearly half of commercial retail rents were not paid. That is an astonishing number. So many landlords are at risk of bankruptcy. Owners of malls and hotels that I've heard from in our district are very much at risk. We provided relief for commercial landlords in the HEROES Act. That's that bill I mentioned sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. And my great hope is that the HEROES Act will move forward. You know, the HEROES Act says that the Fed will provide long-term, low-cost loans to creditors and debt collectors with losses caused by loan forbearance. The Fed is also attempting to shore up the commercial real estate market by purchasing commercial mortgage-backed securities, CMBS. And earlier, the number that I saw was that the Fed had purchased approximately $9 billion in CMBS. And also, they've told banks that they will not be penalized for making reasonable concessions on commercial real estate loans. So the Fed is doing quite a bit. We need to pass the HEROES Act to do more. And I'm hopeful that that provision in the HEROES Act will make its way through when the Senate finally decides what they're going to do. Brenda in Carlsbad, well, similar question to the one we had before. Is Southern California opening up too early? Doctor, do you want to make another blanket comment given what we're seeing?
Yeah, surely. But I don't want to risk getting death threats like poor Dr. Quick. I mean, I say that half jokingly, but it's really remarkable and disturbing, this sort of anti-science rhetoric that we hear, and this crazy anti-vaccine, 5G, Bill Gates, conspiracy stuff. And I think it's unfortunate that more people don't actually look at the science, and they just see something on the internet and assume it to be true because it dovetails with their own personal beliefs. That's unfortunate. Do I think we're opening things up too early? Yeah, I kind of do. I think it's time to roll it back a little bit. And I'd like to hope that we still give people the freedom to do what they want to do, as long as it's not jeopardizing the health and safety of others.
Well, as I've said before, Doctor, the virus doesn't care if you're a Democrat or Republican or independent or a libertarian or a vegetarian. The virus doesn't care. The virus is going to do what the virus does. And that's why it's important that each one of us handles this and approaches this with the seriousness that it demands, which is that it's highly contagious, it's highly infectious. You can get very, very sick. I've had friends my age and younger that I know who've gotten very sick. We can't take this as anything other than what it is, which is a massive public health crisis, a massive economic crisis, and we are not out of the woods. And if cases were going down, deaths were going down, infections were going down, well, then, of course, we could take more steps with more confidence. But what we've seen in the last month or 6 weeks in our region, in our district, and specifically in Orange County is the opposite. We've seen numbers go up, and that's not encouraging, and we have to do better. And I know that we can, and hopefully we will. That's going to require leadership not only from the federal level, but also from many of the states, counties, cities that we're seeing rising rates of infection, death, and hospitalization. So we have to do a lot better. And the other day I saw Vice President Pence say that we're not in the second wave. And I actually agree with them because we're still in the first wave. There can't be a second wave yet because we're not out of the woods on the first wave. So we've got a lot more work to do. Heloisa in Carlsbad says, my question is regarding the opioid pandemic and what has been done about it during COVID-19. Prior to COVID-19 and the protests, there were conversations and support on the necessity of addressing this issue. However, in the midst of the latest happenings, these poor souls have been forgotten and are still in need of support now more than ever. What has been done during the pandemic to help those addicts on the streets that are not in recovery? Well, I certainly haven't forgotten about this issue. Quite the opposite, Heloisa, and I'm grateful for your raising it. We have another epidemic in this country. That is an epidemic of substance abuse and something that we've got to continue to address. I'm a member of the Freshman Working Group on Addiction, which is a bipartisan task force working in Congress to end the addiction crisis in America. And we've made some progress in driving solutions over the past year and a half, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And one thing that I want to make sure of, and I've been focused on, is to keep community health centers open. The pandemic has been such a massive hit to our community health centers. A few weeks ago, we had the medical director for Vista Community Clinic, and the funding that they need to keep their doors open is critical. So what we have done is we have fought for specific aid for our community health centers that provide significant relief to the Medicaid population, and particularly those uninsured who are struggling with substance abuse. In addition, we, in the HEROES Act, provided $3 billion for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to support treatment and outreach. We created a $100 billion emergency rental assistance program to help those families who are struggling due to the financial impact of COVID-19, and that'll hopefully help families during this time of economic uncertainty. And all of these issues are interrelated. Mental health, addiction, and economic uncertainty. And also $1 billion in the HEROES Act for emergency Section 8 housing choice vouchers to assist individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Homelessness we've seen in our community, unfortunately, has gone up as a result of COVID-19. We don't know the specific numbers. We'll know them in the months ahead. But that's one of the big reasons why I wanted to see our veterans work include assistance for the homeless. As a kind of an anecdotal statistic, we've seen the number of telehealth engagements at the VA go from usually around 30,000 a month, and this past month was almost 1 million. And part of that is because the VA facilities are not able to handle patients as normal, but part of that is because people are struggling. And if that's the case in our veteran community, it's the case for our community at large. So I see all these issues as interrelated to varying degrees, and we've got to try to tackle all of them as best as we can. Next question.
Congressman?
Go ahead, Doctor.
Yeah,
Sure.
just on the opioid topic, I think, I've personal family history of substance abuse, opioid use disorders, and I think there probably aren't too many constituents of yours that haven't been touched by the opioid crisis in some
Very true.
in some way. One thing in answer to the question that has been done recently is you're probably familiar with the notion of harm reduction, or, instead of kind of preaching complete abstinence from a substance, we're using medications. Methadone's been around for a long time, but the buprenorphine or Suboxone, that's much more readily available now. And one of the things that makes it a little bit more accessible these days is that there have been waivers. You used to have to get a special DEA number to prescribe it, for opioid use disorder. Now it's relatively simple to get that and to be able to prescribe it. And the other thing is that it can now be prescribed fairly readily via telemedicine. So, you used to, somebody would have to come to the office and you'd watch them take it or those types of things. That's not the case now. And San Diego County has an excellent drug abuse task force. And I know that some of the emergency rooms have the ability to get people started on this. I'm not suggesting that should be your first, the first place you go. And as the congressman mentioned, community clinics are a good place to go. So if somebody is suffering from an opioid use disorder, I think it's relatively easier to get Suboxone these days, and I would encourage people to consider that. It's much better than overdosing on heroin and dying, or the Chinese fentanyl, or whatever else is out there on the street these days.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Another question for you from Walker. What is the current status of COVID-19 testing for vaccines, both to prevent and treat coronavirus?
Okay, well, yeah, I'm going to give you the short answer on that, but let's just say that right now there are about almost 150 vaccines, different vaccines in various phases of development. And out of those, there are 3 that have reached phase 3. And phase 3 trials are where you're basically, it's past the first couple of stages and you're testing it on thousands of people. So there are 3 vaccines that are at that level now. There's 8 that are at phase 2, which is usually in the hundreds, 10 that are in phase 1, which is, just a handful of people. And then the rest are all, the other 100 and some are all preclinical. And they're actually doing a couple things to speed up the development of this virus. There's this, some federal funding that is called Warp Speed. I love that, right? And let's hope it comes true, right? And they're consolidating phase 1 and 2 with some of these trials. And for people who have concerns about the vaccines, and some of my friends have said, well, I'm not going to be one of the first ones to get it. I mean, who knows if it's going to be, they'll find out something awful about it later. I think the safety of vaccines is pretty much, it's very well established, right? I mean, there are rare vaccine reactions, but when you look at the overall good they do, there seems to be, to me, there's no question. And I will not be afraid to be one of the first ones to get the vaccine when it's available. On the other hand, none of these vaccines that are being studied contain any live virus. So that should be somewhat reassuring to some people that don't like the idea of, putting something in you that could be harmful. And there are some very creative vaccines. If you want to know more, I would suggest, Walker, going to the New York Times and just looking at the coronavirus vaccine tracker. It's an outstanding source of information, probably way more than anybody really needs to know about it, unless maybe you're thinking of investing in one of the companies or something like that. And the other thing, while we're talking about vaccines and immunity, that I'm probably worth mentioning today is many of you probably saw in the last week or so, there's some concern that people who develop immunity to this because of being exposed to the coronavirus will not actually develop any kind of long-standing immunity to it. And it looks like from these kind of small early studies that if you have a severe case, you're more likely to have long-standing immunity. But if you have a very mild case, or if you're asymptomatic and just test positive for it, it may be that within a couple of months, you will no longer have antibodies to it. And so that's a little concerning, because I think a lot of us were hoping that, well, hell, I got it. Now I got a free pass. I can go, work with sick people and not worry that much about, that does not necessarily appear to be the case. So I just wanted to share that with our viewers.
And Dr. Steinberg, if I read it correctly, it's for those who test positive or the antibody test is positive but didn't have symptoms, correct? For
those are the people. Right, who would be most likely to no longer have antibodies a couple of months later.
But if they did get sick, then they very likely the antibodies might last longer. Is that correct?
That's the way it looks in these initial small studies. So we'll see if
Got
it
it.
turns out to
I
be
hope
true.
not. I hope not to find out. Knock wood. I'm knocking on my desk. Next question from Sam in San Juan Capistrano. Sam writes, I'm a relatively new resident of Southern Orange County. Welcome, Sam. Great to have you as a constituent. And I'm wondering if you could please give a short history and update on the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant. Oh man, now I'm going to have to look at my watch, Doctor. I'll go quickly. What I will tell you, Sam, first and foremost, I would encourage you to go to our website, mikelevin.house.gov, where you can get our report. This report that we just released today from our San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station Task Force will tell you everything you ever wanted to know, and probably a lot of things you didn't want to know about the site, about the plant, which produced power for many years. 2 gigawatts of electricity was shut down after some malfunctioning of the steam generators. Hasn't produced electricity in a number of years, and it just happens to be located, within 50 miles of 9 million of us. So that's part of the joy of living in our community. As beautiful a community as it is, we do have 1,600 tons of radioactive spent nuclear fuel right in the middle of our district. You also have earthquake faults, which I'm obviously concerned about, given their proximity to the plant. And you've got a rising sea level, and the waste is only 100 feet away from the Pacific Ocean. So we've got to get that waste away from the coast as quickly and as safely as we can. Not to mention, we've got one of the most important strategic assets of the United States Marine Corps and the Department of Defense right across the freeway in Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. So for a whole myriad of reasons, that waste has got to go. And the problem is where to send it to. For many, many years, actually 1987, Congress determined that Yucca Mountain in Nevada would be the only place that we would send the nation's spent nuclear fuel from roughly 100 sites all across the United States. So between 1987 and all through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, American taxpayers invested billions and billions and billions of dollars. I've gone and visited Yucca Mountain in Nevada. It's quite a feat of engineering, 5 miles of tunnels deep below the surface. But there's overwhelming community opposition in Nevada to moving the nation's nuclear waste there. So it was clear to me we needed to create a task force of experts to study the issue and figure out the best path forward. And we've done that with the 2 co-chairs being the former head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Greg Yasko, and Len Herring, who's a retired Rear Admiral in the Navy. He was the Navy Mayor of San Diego. Their task force came out with 30 recommendations. 8 of them are federal in scope. One of them we're already doing is the Spent Fuel Prioritization Act, HR 2995, which we introduced last year, which says for all of those nuclear waste sites across the United States, prioritize moving the waste first from those sites with the highest seismic risk and the highest population density. Not surprising, we finish first on that list. It's not necessarily a list that I want to finish first on, but we do. There's a lot more that we're going to be doing, and I'd love for you to read our report and send our office your feedback. And again, Sam, welcome to our wonderful community. We're glad you're here. We have time for just a couple more, and I want to ask you each a question, and then we'll go to our close. And Reverend Shockley, I will start with you. You've talked some about the Justice in Policing Act. I appreciate your discussion of that. But besides that, what kinds of reforms are you hoping to see, particularly at this moment where there's more mobilization, more organization around doing something meaningful than at any time in our lifetimes, perhaps?
Well, I will reiterate a couple of things, that we have to revisit the contracts in our local communities, because that's where the rubber hits the road. And we have to figure out ways to have accountability, because without accountability, there will be no change in behavior. We have civilian police review committees in a variety of localities, but many of them are toothless or powerless to really hold officers accountable. As I mentioned, the state police officers' Bill of Rights contains a lot of provisions that shield officers from accountability. Until our communities rise up and say, we insist that, like everyone else, there are consequences for actions, especially actions that are deadly or cause great physical harm to members of the community, not to mention the social harm that is caused by this ongoing misbehavior by police officers in some of our departments. So we have to have these measures of accountability, and that will take the form of citizen review committees. That will take the form of different approaches to policing, not the warrior mentality, but community-based policing. It will take re-examining whether every need in our community requires an armed response. And so while I know the controversial phrase defund the police is making the rounds, we have to understand that in many countries of this world, part of the police force are not armed with deadly weapons. And so we can start to look at other ways of policing our communities that de-escalate the violence that is occurring in our communities. So we might not defund the police, but we might disarm some of the police units so that we can reduce the potential for deadly harm in our communities. And so we have to look at all of these measures as we try to have a completely different mindset about public safety. People have been asking for reform for 100 years, and it's gotten nowhere. And so our millennials and the new activists are saying defund the police to try to move this conversation forward. We should not close our ears to their cries, because that's what has brought us here. We closed our ears to the reform movement, and now they're talking about defunding the police departments to reinvest those resources into opioid prevention, to reinvest those dollars into social work, to reinvest those dollars into education, into youth opportunities. And I think that will do more to reduce crime and reduce violence perpetrated by the police in our communities, and reduce community violence than simply adding more officers, adding more dollars to the police department, which has been our answer for years. And so those are the kinds of things that have to change. We have to change our budgets. And so look at how we can really allocate the resources in ways that allow our communities to move into a peaceful future.
Well, thank you for that, Reverend. What I would say is that we cannot allow ourselves to politicize this issue and fall into the false trap that some who are not particularly well-intentioned are trying to set. I don't support defunding the police. I certainly don't support dismantling the police. I'm a big believer in public safety, and certainly have many friends in the law enforcement community. But I think what this moment does require is a serious evaluation of the roles and responsibilities, and frankly, the expectations that we place on our law enforcement officers. I'm trying to do whatever I can to help build bridges and to help create partnerships, particularly around issues like mental health, where law enforcement officers will be among those who will tell you that they are being asked to do too much outside of the core responsibility. Agree that while the calls for reform have not been met with the actions, I do think this moment is different. And it better be, Reverend, because we've got a huge amount of consensus within at least the Democratic caucus, and even behind the scenes, some of my Republican friends, and as I mentioned, those in law enforcement who just months ago were unwilling to concede that any reforms were necessary, are now making statements on the record to the House of Representatives, embracing many of the things that they would not have just a few months back. So we've just got to keep up the momentum and not get stuck in a false trap, a false narrative where they're trying to overtly politicize something that is inherently worthy of a more thoughtful discussion. So what can I say? With that, I want to turn to you, Dr. Steinberg, and I have a very simple question, but a very important question. Can you please just take a minute and remind our viewers and listeners why it's so important to wear a mask?
Sure, and I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence. I think the data are quite clear in spite of what you might read in certain circles or what you might see on certain TV stations and whatnot. And the example that some of our so-called leaders are demonstrating in public, it's clear that wearing a mask, even a cloth mask, is quite effective. If everybody were to wear a cloth mask, it would reduce transmission by somewhere around 80%. That's pretty good, right? That's,
That's really good. 80%? Are you kidding me? That's better than pretty good.
Yeah, that's good, right? Even though it's not going to prevent every little virus particle from maybe getting out. And I just remind people that there's really three factors as far as your probability of getting the virus, right? One is proximity, right? How close are you to the person? And the closer you are, the more likely you are, because as the virus is coming out of the person, you're going to get a more concentrated stream of it, right? Secondly is duration. How long were you in proximity to that person? The longer you're in proximity, like if you're on a 4-hour plane ride, which I know the congressman just was recently. I'm sure he was very safe.
Don't remind me.
Right?
But I was wearing a mask the entire time. I promise you. I had my mask on, just like that.
Good.
By the way, I want to give great credit to United Airlines. I thought they did a fantastic job. Not only were we all wearing masks, but United has partnered with Clorox and the Cleveland Clinic on what I thought was really a good program, and I wish all the airlines would do the same. But I digress. Go ahead, doctor.
So that was 2 out of 3, and the last one is like the level of infectivity. So if a person is quite ill, they probably are going to have a lot of virus particles, whereas a person who's asymptomatic, or having very mild symptoms will probably have less sort of a viral load. So those are the 3 factors you have to keep in mind. And one thing that's going to help on all of them is wearing a mask. It's going to, cut down the amount of virus, if there is virus, that you might be spreading to somebody else, whether you know you have it or not. And by the same token, it's going to somewhat decrease your probability of getting it. In a common courtesy, decency, and to turn this into something political just baffles me. It really does, and it saddens me, because I like to think that our fellow Americans, our fellow Southern Californians, care deeply about one another, and to basically just say, in the sort of interest of so-called personal freedom, I'm going to do something that puts others at risk. It seems so selfish and so I don't know, small-minded and unnecessary. And I see people out there that are just sort of flaunting that, oh, hell no, I won't wear a mask. And I'm going to go in your store, whether you have a rule against it or not. And, I think breaking rules is great. I think questioning authority is wonderful. But I do think when other people's lives are on the line, especially our frail, vulnerable elders, it's really time to take a long look at ourselves and say, why? Why would we not do this simple thing? It's nothing more than a minor inconvenience, and we're doing something that may save people's actual lives, somebody's grandmother's life. And anyway, and while I'm on the screen here, I just want to say about the police. I have friends, both black and white, who are police officers, and I wouldn't want to be them right now. It's a very difficult time for them. I think a great majority of them are good people who are doing a job that I would be very afraid to do, even under the best of circumstances. I admire them, and I'm thankful for them. And it's a shame that you've got some bad apples that can seemingly spoil the whole bunch. But I just want to, thank our police officers and say, the police officers I know are not against accountability. They're not against wearing a camera, and they want to do the right thing. So anyway, I just thought I'd.
And again, let us not forget, Dr. Steinberg, that just a few weeks back, it was the House Democrats who passed the HEROES Act, which included a $200 billion emergency hazard pay fund, which would directly benefit, among others, our law enforcement community. So it really is a false narrative out there, and I hope that common sense will prevail for the good of our residents. Now, Reverend Shockley, you had a great mass, but you're going to have to show this mass to our viewers.
Yeah,
It's
everybody
fantastic.
else wants to see it. Oh,
there it is. Jeremy's got it.
This is the gift I have waiting for you, Congressmember Levin.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I will wear it proudly on.
Hey, can I get one of those?
You can get one too. So next time I see you, I'll have it for you.
Yay.
I love it. I love it. Well, with that, Reverend, I want to give you the opportunity for a closing statement, and then we'll go to Dr. Steinberg and we'll close it out. So Reverend Shockley, take it away.
I want to say that I am a card-carrying optimist, and that I think that in this moment, we are standing at the hinge of history, that something is going to change that will redirect our future, both in regard to our health. COVID-19, I think, has caused us to relook at family life. I think that after this episode of COVID-19, we're going to be relooking at how we raise our families, whether we can come to an economy that will support a single income family once again, so that we can spend the time with our children that we've missed. I think that this moment in history will allow us to reorient ourselves to one another, to start to see each other as human beings, to understand the history that has brought us to this moment, and how we each have the power and the possibility of shaping the history that will be our future.
Wow. Thank you so much, Reverend. Amazingly well said. Dr. Steinberg, I wouldn't want to follow that, but as best as you can, if you want to give us some concluding thoughts on COVID-19 and where we are.
Well, that's just what I was going to say. Hard to go after that, other than to just say amen, right? And I pray that does turn out to be, that this turns out to be a pivotal moment, and maybe some of the misery of these last 3.5 years and the misery that we still have to come will result in some truly meaningful and enduring change. So as far as the COVID-19, I will just say yet again, please wear a mask, please wash your hands, please continue to socially distance. If you do decide to go out, consider the risk that you're taking. And you know, we do have lots of rights and we have freedom, and let's just use that in a prudent way. And I would also just again want to say, God bless our CNAs, nursing assistants. You guys rock. And, you know, God forbid that I someday need to be in a nursing home. I pray that there will be enough CNAs around to do the job, and that they are the kind, caring, wonderful people that they have today.
They are amazing people. My dad ran skilled nursing facilities for a number of years in his career, and it was I think my first job ever was actually at a skilled nursing facility, and I got to know many of the CNAs and LVNs and RNs. They're all amazing. The CNAs during this time when the risk of transmission of COVID is very high in a nursing home environment, they can't socially distance, they can't do a lot of the things that we recommend people do just by nature of their work. So we're incredibly grateful to them and all of our frontline workers, our nurses, our doctors who are doing an amazing job. I wanted to give a shout out to my wife, to our kids. My son just turned 8 years old, and it was a very special Father's Day getting to celebrate with my dad from a distance with a mask on in our backyard. But also the celebration of my son's 8th birthday was terrific. I want to thank my wife for putting up with me for the last month or so, and love her very much. We're going to be celebrating our 9th wedding anniversary on Thursday remotely, but it'll have to do. I want to thank my parents and my in-laws. Love you all very much. Thank you for watching these town halls. And want to thank my team. They've done a great, great job. As I mentioned, this is, I believe, our 26th, 27th one of these since March. They've just been amazing. Thank you to our Chief Kara and our Communications Director, Eric, and all those who make these possible. I hope this was informative. I hope you learned something, and I can't stress enough what Dr. Steinberg said. Please follow the public health guidelines that are out there. They're very simple, very straightforward, and so critically important. And the better job we do following those guidelines, better job we're going to be able to do in reopening our economy in a safe manner. And that's what we all want. And on behalf of card-carrying optimists everywhere, Reverend Shockley, incredibly well said in terms of what this moment hopefully will produce, which is lasting change that is so desperately needed. And I've said before, I'll say again, the only way I see us getting through this is if we start listening to one another, start helping each other, particularly those who need the most help. Let's speak up, let's advocate, and let's eventually get those changes that we all know need to take place. I'm hopeful that we'll be on that path tomorrow when we vote and pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So until I see you next, we'll be taking a week off for Independence Day. You heard that right. We're not taking a week off altogether. We're taking a week off from our town halls. So the next town hall that we're going to be doing that you will see is Wednesday, July the 8th. In advance of that, I hope everyone has a wonderful Independence Day weekend. So thank you all, and we'll see you on July the 8th. Take care.
Thank you.